Phew, all right. Well, we got the balloon off the ground. Now we're going to recreate the path that it flew for you using Google Earth, and we're going to do this in 3 dimensions. Now, as you saw from the video, the launch was rather chaotic, and the reason for that was because here in Michigan, Leslie, Michigan, at the Woodworth Elementary School on that day, the winds were 20 to 30 miles an hour out of the west. We had gusts over 40 miles per hour. The temperatures were mid to low 30s, and we had driving wind and sleet and snow even at some points, which all made it a very large challenge, and we were pretty delighted when we got the thing off the ground at 11:53 a.m. But then unfortunately immediately lost all forms of communication with it. The balloon, though, kept a solid 3D lock for the first 7 minutes of its flight, which took it from here at Woodworth Elementary School to 8 miles away and about 11,400 feet up, where probably because the box was spinning and getting tossed around so much, it lost enough satellites that the signal dropped altogether. Now, unfortunately, due to a coding error, when the signal dropped, the package actually ceased logging all forms of data, including barometric pressure and temperature. The result of this is that this point here, where it reacquired, is the next data point. In between here, there's literally no data, hence just this arrow straight line in between the two. This GPS blackout was about 51 minutes long. It represents 47 miles of travel between just outside of Leslie and then over Superior Township, and then a 60,000 foot ascent during that period to bring it right here, which is about 71,500 feet when GPS was reacquired. Now, this does not mean we had communications. Up to this point, we still had not resumed communications that we'd lost just after launch. Now, the balloon, shortly after that, it went up to its highest point, which is 84,202.1 feet, which is also, not surprisingly, the point where the pressure was the lowest as well. As we can see here from a pressure versus altitude graph, this looks the way one would expect, about 980 millimeters of mercury down at ground level, and then this nice smooth exponential decay like curve all the way down to a value of about 11 millimeters of mercury up around the ceiling of just over 84,000 feet. Very much what would be expected to be seen here. Now, the balloon loitered here around 84,000 feet plus for about 11 minutes before it burst, which you can see here very dramatically when it takes a downturn and starts plummeting. And I mean, it really plummeted. This yellow arrow here represents the fastest recorded rate of descent, which at 7,738 feet per minute was a bit over 88 miles per hour. Now, this is also about the time where this car here began to pick up a radio transmission. This car, and only this one car out of all the chase vehicles, had a dedicated radio link to the box that should have had a range about 30 miles. And we picked this up coming down, and we only had XY coordinates and had no altitude. And we actually thought initially that it was that it was on the ground around Domino's Farms, because if I zoom around this you can see around that yellow arrow, it's literally going straight down. So to us, it looked like it wasn't moving at all until it began to get right kind of down around here, and it started to creep to the east again, and then we could kind of see that it was actually indeed coming down. It was interesting here, this negative 15.2 degree snowflake represents the coldest point of the flight, which I will now pull up a temperature versus altitude graph. This one's not nearly as pretty as the pressure versus altitude graph. It's very chaotic, but it reveals an interesting temperature inversion. We see here at the start, as altitude increases, the temperature rapidly decreases as expected, and this holds until 38,500 feet right here. We have a negative 15 degree plus point. This is the snowflake on the 3-dimensional graph. After this, the temperature actually begins to increase with altitude, and then up to this point, where admittedly this is rather ambiguous, is bobbing around 80,000 feet. So here it's passing through the same altitude multiple times. There's multiple data points, and it becomes an eyesore. But this zone here, we believe, represents good data. And this is from about 71,000 feet to 77,500 feet. The temperature was between -5, -10 degrees, kind of an average around -7 degrees, which is appreciably warmer than the -15 degrees that was occurring 40,000 feet lower. So apparently there was a cold layer here that the balloon went through on the way down, and presumably probably went through on the way up, but unfortunately we weren't logging data, so we don't know the extent of that cold area. Okay, not long after going through this, the coldest part, it started to get into thicker air, and the descent rate slowed down from this ridiculous 88 miles per hour to about 23 miles per hour, about 2,000 feet per minute on the way down, which seems to be the parachute and package's terminal velocity in the lower air column. It never really sped up or slowed down beyond 23 miles per hour. But the ground speed became astonishingly fast. Here we hit 107 miles per hour when it passed through about 15,600 feet, which, given about a 23 mile an hour vertical speed, would equate to 125, 130 mile an hour impact speed, which would have reduced the box to just rubble, which you'll see from the video following this is not the case. It really put on the brakes here, and it slowed down from 107 miles per hour to about 23 mile per hour ground speed, and then still kept its 23 mile an hour vertical component, and that was the speed it was going when it ended up hitting here at R&M Machine and Mold, which is a little machine shop on Ecorse Drive right on the border of Romulus and Taylor. Now if I switch this to a more orthogonal view, we can see this is not an ideal landing point, because this is Detroit Metropolitan Airport. These are the outer perimeter. It's about exactly 1 mile from the touchdown point to being on the tarmac at Detroit Metro, which we're not certain what that would have entailed to try to retrieve a balloon from within there, to try to get it back from the FAA, but we're pretty certain it would have been a lot more problematic than just plucking it from some weeds at the edge of a parking lot, which is what we in fact did. So now, just to get an idea of the size of this, I'll kind of zoom around it, and you can see I'm zoomed out at a decent length already. We can see pretty much all of Lake Erie, all of Lake St. Clair. I can zoom out even more, and we can start making out the whole state, really. And the balloon flight still looks very large. It ended up traveling a total distance along the ground in a straight line of about 57 miles in an hour and 37 minutes. Hit near space. Over 75,000 feet is near space. It hit close to 85,000 feet. And it's really a fairly large flight.